Welcome to this edition of Water New Zealand's podcast series, Tawara or Tuwai. I'm John Reid from Water New Zealand, and with me is my co-host, Emily Alfoa. So as the water reform process moves into the next phase, we're going to be under pressure to squeeze the best value out of every dollar we spend on much needed infrastructure.
Really, it's looking at the lower cost alternatives that we should be examining before we commit to building new.
The New Zealand Infrastructure Commission, Te Waihanga, has also been looking into this, and today we're talking to the Commission's Jeff Whitty about the recent work around the National Infrastructure Plan. Jeff studied as a water resources engineer and worked in water and wastewater in Canada before moving to Aotearoa, New Zealand. He now works in the policy team for the Infrastructure Commission. Kia ora, Jeff.
Kia ora. Thanks so much for having me on.
Thanks for joining us. Emily, over to you.
Tēnā koe, Jeff. Nau mai haere mai ki Tawara o te wai. Straight into it, can you share an overview of Te Waihanga, the Infrastructure Commission, and then how it connects or intersects with the water sector?
Sure, yeah, I can do. The Infrastructure Commission hasn't been around that long, but we're part of the public sector. We're the government's independent advisor for infrastructure issues. There's line ministries that are responsible for their individual sectors, but we've got some purview over all sectors, how they cross-connect. We commission a lot of our own research on construction productivity, the extent to which infrastructure can support economic growth. We've done some specific ones in the water sector, one called Valuing Water, which explored the merits of volumetric charging. We've done work to see, what does the public think is fair when it comes to charging and different network services. So there's a range of research and publications that can support the water sector. We draw on them to provide advice to ministers and to sector agencies. We also administer the National Infrastructure Pipeline, which we might touch on later, and provide advice on some of government's biggest and most complex infrastructure projects.
So let's talk a bit more about the actual National Infrastructure Plan. Where are some of the those key features of the plan? How do those in particular relate to the water industry and the work of the teams in our industry?
Yeah, the National Infrastructure Plan is one of our key documents. It's something like this is published every 5 years, and our most recent one was just published a few weeks ago. It's probably best to start by saying what it's not. There's probably a lot of people anticipated that a national infrastructure plan is going to show us what are the key projects that we need to invest in for the next 30 years. But as an organization, we're really big on cost-benefit analysis. We've got to know the value of where we're putting our money and trying to identify what are the costs associated with projects that haven't been scoped yet, haven't had their site investigations done, etc. It's pretty daunting and probably wouldn't benefit the nation as much as what we've done instead, which is identify 10 key priorities for the decade ahead, one of which is for the water sector, particularly to catch up on all its renewals. We've published some work that we call forward guidance, which is looking at how much can we afford to spend as a nation, so we know how much of our national wallet we can put towards each of these challenges. And then the plan presents 16 recommendations that in one way or another are looking to make our money go further.
Kia ora, Jeff. That's really interesting. I've noticed in a couple of your responses, you've spoken to making our dollar go further, looking at how we can service future productivity and economic growth. When you're looking at the priorities for the decade ahead in this National Infrastructure Plan, is it purely around the cost of how to move forward as a nation, or are these priorities encompassing, the opportunity, the environmental costs, as well as the economic costs, our social construct? How wide does this plan look for infrastructure?
Yeah, we've tried to take quite a wider lens. Certainly the economics features prominently, but there's 8 different drivers that we identified in preparing what we call our forward guidance. Some of that is making up for the infrastructure that we haven't got enough of. Some of it is demographics. What is our population change going to look like in terms of numbers and in age? What sort of services do New Zealanders need in the future? Decarbonization requirements is another pressing one. Make sure that we're investing enough in the right spots. Resilience to natural hazards is yet another. Costs associated with inflation. There's a whole range of aspects that we've tried to consider when we're identifying what are both the key priorities and how much can we afford to spend on each of them.
Kia ora, thank you for explaining that. So, can you tell us a little bit more about the Commission's forward guidance?
Yeah, I tend to think of it as an affordability envelope. Essentially what it's done is looked back in time over the past 150 years to see how much has New Zealand been able to spend on its infrastructure services. And we found that it kind of ranged between 5 and 7% of GDP. As our economy grows, we get wealthier, our incomes rise, but we're still only spending about that 5 to 7%. And over the past 20 years, which we're particularly interested in, it's been around 6%, kind of right in that middle, 5.8. So it's providing us that a sense of scale. There's lots of sectors that they all need more money. They all say we can deliver better outcomes if only we had more people and more resources. But there's a limit to how much households can afford to spend, which says that we need to make trade-offs. So the forward guidance is also looking at where is it likely those trade-offs need to be made? Where are our most pressing needs driven by some of those factors we were just talking to about decarbonization and natural hazards and demographics. These have identified for us some sectors like the energy sector. We need to be spending a lot more to electrify our economy. Health services are going to require more infrastructure to support them with an aging population. It's identified other sectors like the transport sector that probably needs a little bit less investment than it's had in the past. And water, interestingly, there'll be a lot that figure, given the underinvestment over the past couple of decades, that we must need to provide a lot more investment going forward. And that's certainly the case in the near term. There's a lot of catch up to be done on renewals. But our forward guidance suggests that over time we'll have less to invest in growth and level of service, and that our forward guidance is suggesting we've got about 0.6% of GDP that we can spend on water services. Over time, we see that moderating down to about 0.5.
You mentioned that the plan includes about 16 recommendations. I presume some of them are relevant to the water sector. Can you tell us a bit more about those that have that relevance to us?
Yeah, it's true. There are a number of recommendations. To be honest, most of them are geared towards central government. Some of them will have some relevance across all sectors. They focus on planning for not everything under the sun, but plan for what we can afford. Let's make sure that we're managing the assets that we've already got. We talk about prioritizing the right projects. So when we are making new investments, we're putting our money in the best spots. And then ways to make it easier to build, including resource management and reform, workforce development, spatial planning, developing those leadership skills. And then there's a range of recommendations in each of those categories that are probably relevant to anyone. What might be more relevant for the water sector is some of the 10 priorities that we identified. One of those is catching up on renewals. We certainly see that in the water service delivery plans that are coming through, that renewals feature prominently in investment plans, which is great to see. But we also talked about it's not the case that all of our communities are growing. We tend to focus a lot on them, but there's a lot of communities that populations are slowing. Their growth isn't growing as much as it was in the past. In some cases, it might be declining. And putting forward some ideas on how you might manage your assets on the downside, specifically making sure you're not building ahead of demand, considering a range of alternate scenarios and what your investment might look like, in future, considering asset recycling. Another of those key priorities was identifying cost-effective flood infrastructure. Within that, some of the key actions we floated was the prospect of the Crown paying targeted rates towards flood protection on the properties that it benefits from. Continuing our work to improve access to natural hazard data and ensuring that projects receive the right assurance that you get some third-party advice to make sure that investments are going to stack up. We also identified upzoning around network corridors. If we're going to try to constrain the amount that we spend, it's best to focus development on the areas where we've already got capacity. So around those key transport corridors and water networks that have got capacity already is where we want to be focusing our development to keep some of those network costs down.
You mentioned a phrase, asset recycling. It's a really interesting point to reflect on areas or regions that may not be growing or may actually be declining, because I haven't spoken about that too much, at least in this context. Can you perhaps reflect a little more on that asset recycling or the asset management piece sitting in renewals? Because I think people hear a national infrastructure plan and potentially do lean into that sense of building new, catering to growth, and not so much in the asset management or asset recycling realm.
Yeah, it's one of the things that we're most focused on, is getting the most from our existing assets. We've done some analysis that suggests about 60% of all the money we spend on infrastructure really needs to be going towards maintaining and renewing the assets that we've already got. We published some guidance back in December that's really setting out some best practice principles on how to manage assets and understand what you've got. And really part of that is leaning into the need to identify what your needs are, understand what demand is for your services, where that demand might change over time, identifying which assets you're going to need for a long term and which ones you might not need for a long term will help determine where best to put your resources.
So this theme around asset management and making the best of what we've already got keeps on coming up in a lot of our podcasts in the recent past, and it's so important for the water industry. I just wonder if there's some examples or some more detail of how we can really take that forwards in our planning. If there's some more guidance around that in the National Infrastructure Plan, or some context that you could give our listeners that might help them actually take this forwards.
We published some work a couple of years ago that it was called Build or Maintain, and it was looking at data, New Zealand-based data across a range of sectors to identify the degree to which we're keeping up with renewals. And we found that in the water sector, you've got to renew your water assets to keep up with the rate at which they're depreciating. But that's not always the case. And water specifically, drinking water was about 20% less investment in renewals than what we would have expected. In wastewater, it was about 35% less. And in stormwater, it was 50% less than what you'd expect. And that period between the 70s and mid-80s, there was a lot less being spent in the water sector when compared to our other international comparators, other countries that we compare ourselves to. That's certainly changed in the past decade or so. There's been a lot more investment, but we're keen to make sure that that investment is being put into the right places. The electricity sector is a good one, and I don't have a specific example. I won't call out a specific entity, but some of them are regulated by the Commerce Commission, and that regulation, that discipline of documenting their asset management plans, presenting it in a transparent way through information disclosure, that's quite useful. We've found that it's increased asset management maturity. And some work that we've done in looking across a range of sectors shows that sectors that are regulated by the Commerce Commission or have got other information disclosure requirements tend to have the best asset management maturity, because there's somebody that cares. There's an audience for it. There's an opportunity to compare performance against peers. And I think that's a great opportunity that the water sector's got to look forward to.
Yeah, it's definitely something that we picked up on from one of our recent podcasts with the Commerce Commission around information disclosure and asset management, and improvement in asset management practice being a real focus of that team. So let's hope that that all comes together.
Thinking back to your earlier comment, Jeff, I found it good to take stock myself and look at the balance of where we as a nation of Aotearoa need to spend money. I care mostly about water, so I think in that world, but actually we've got so many other sectors, and it leads into this need to make sure that what we're investing in as a nation is affordable. Is there anything more you can talk to within the recommendations or the priorities in the National Infrastructure Plan that lean into these concepts of affordability and value for money?
Yeah, absolutely. It's something that we're quite focused on ourselves. One thing that's worth taking a look at is what are the drivers of cost? What makes things unaffordable? And one of the things we found is that we consume as a nation a lot more water than similarly sized countries with similar kind of makeup and demographics. And it's about 100% more than the average. So it's quite a lot, right? And that drives a lot of cost. And there's a range of things that can be done. I mentioned a report that we published a couple of years ago called Valuing Water that looked at the merits of volumetric charging. Where does it make sense to install water meters? What's been the domestic experience? And certainly found that consumption levels come down when you give people an economic incentive to conserve. Really, the big impact that has is deferring the need for big new capital investments. When you got to find a new water supply, that's a big ticket item. And ways that we can make better use of the resources we've got and the networks we've got in their current state are things that we look at. Ways to avoid building new things, and volumetric charging, we think offers a lot of promise. It's not the only opportunity, though. The National Infrastructure Plan identifies what we might call as an intervention hierarchy. It's kind of a complex word, but really it's looking at the lower cost alternatives that we should be examining before we commit to building new. That might be demand management. It might be network optimization steps. One of those key priorities was also talking about upzoning. So another term, a bit of jargon, but how do we make sure that new development is being focused in the areas where we've got capacity already and not having to extend networks and increase investment in networks. There's value in building business casing skills within organizations so that you can weigh up the costs and benefits accurately across the range of options and make sure that we're investing in the right things. And then once we've landed on what investments we think make sense, it's great to get some third-party assurance over it. What's been missed? These things are expensive, and it's often well worth our time to make sure there's multiple views and opinions going into making those investment decisions.
Thanks, Jeff. So if there are water sector leaders listening into this and they want to take some of this advice on board, what are some of the tools that are in the work that you've done or the Commission has done to help them to develop a plan going forwards?
We've spoken a bit about asset management, and we've got some guidance on our website that could be useful for a range of organizations. It touches on some of the key performance metrics. What are the things that you'd look for in a well-performing asset management system that might be useful? The National Infrastructure Pipeline is another excellent resource that supported a lot of our advice in the plan. The pipeline, it compiles projects from all sectors and all infrastructure providers, whether they be publicly funded or privately funded. In the water space, there's over 3,600 individual projects listed in it. Contractors are always asking, what's in your pipeline? The National Infrastructure Pipeline is the source for that information. It can support them in identifying when it makes sense to invest in their business, We're extracting insights around what sort of skill sets are needed going forward. But to your question, John, it's really also a resource to support water service providers as they are planning and sequencing their own projects. Look at what your neighbors are doing. You don't want to go to market necessarily all at once. Let's try to avoid boom and bust cycles that kind of sap productivity. What skill sets are in highest demand at certain times, and can we phase our projects in a way that makes use of the resources we've got? So we certainly encourage water service providers out there to keep contributing to that pipeline on a quarterly basis. And increasingly, we'd love to hear your experiences as you're extracting insights from it.
It's been really fascinating to talk with you, Jeff, and hear around the National Infrastructure Plan, the pipeline, the tools that are available to us. We have a range of listeners with Tawara o Te Wai, but I think it would be wonderful to wrap up on something, a take-home message or a challenge. So if we've got water sector leaders, operators, practitioners listening to us now, what's one thing from the National Infrastructure Plan that you would like to reiterate for them to take home?
The water sector works within a system, and the National Infrastructure Plan is trying to touch on a lot of aspects of that system, and it's really tough to boil it down into just one. But one thing I find myself going back to often in the plan is some advice we provided around governance and oversight. It's equally applicable to all successful sectors. When we recognize that effective governance and oversight is so important, but it's often underpinned by some similar characteristics. One is accountability. There needs to be mechanisms to ensure that those that are making decisions are held accountable for those decisions. Get better performance that way. Underpinning accountability is transparency. People need to be able to see the basis of the decisions organizations are making. And another important one is autonomy. It's pretty difficult to hold anybody to account if there's multiple decision makers, if decision making is confused. So having sufficient degrees of autonomy across each sector, can really help. And when I apply some of that to what we see under local water done well, we see there's some positive alignment in areas. We've talked a little bit about information disclosure and the degree it can improve asset management outcomes. But it's also really fundamentally about improving transparency and improving accountability. And if you've been struggling in an organization to get enough traction for your asset management spend, well, now you got a regime that's going to require it. There's an audience for it. It's going to turn boards and counselors' attention to it in a greater way than in the past. So I think that transparency and accountability elements are certainly there. Another piece that I like is the requirement for financial ring fencing. That's quite a positive step. It helps improve autonomy. It means that the money an organization brings in is set aside for it to invest in the places that it deems most wisely. And you can't have full accountability if you've got question marks about where your funding comes from, whether you can rely on it, whether it might get spirited away elsewhere. So I think overall there's a few things to look forward to in the water sector. Lots of challenges, of course, but there's some underpinnings that I think is now there for the sector to grasp up and make the best use of.
Thank you, Jeff, for joining Emily and myself today. It was great to talk to you about the work of the Infrastructure Commission and the National Infrastructure Plan. Thank you for listening to this latest episode. We're back again soon with the next one.